Well, welcome back to the Unpolished MBA. I'm your host, Monique Mills. And in today's episode, it's actually a really important one we've been talking about in quite a few of my posts on LinkedIn, because the country is in a very strange place right now in understanding how we want to move forward and trying to understand the moral foundation for capitalism. So capitalism, we would say, is under pressure right now. And when that happens, it appears that the foundation is starting to crack. And everyday Americans are getting squeezed, maybe rising prices on tariffs, right? Healthcare battles, lots of different things are happening. And I am honored to have a guest with me who has been a researcher on this and also an author. Douglas Stevens is the author of In Search of a Moral Foundation for Capitalism. And his work looks at this problem from a long view and all the way through the modern era. So, Doug, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Monique, and the pleasure is all mine. This reminds me of the good old days when I was a disc jockey for an AM radio station at Spring Arbor College, where I was an undergrad in liberal arts with a major in music and a minor in philosophy. My father was not very happy. He was a business professor at the same school, and he was always telling me, Doug, how are you going to earn a living? And so it wasn't until afterward, after I was married and I had a little baby girl, and I was going through various entrepreneurial ventures from commodities brokerage to insurance and investments, and finally decided I better go back and get my MBA. So I'm an unpolished MBA, just like you. I'm very entrepreneurial, really enjoy. More and more of my MBA students are entrepreneurial. I really appreciate all of your leadership and teaching in entrepreneurial science here at Georgia State. And so I'm very honored to be able to talk to you a little bit about what I do and a little bit of how that links up with entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And for those of you who have not seen the post on LinkedIn, you may not know this, but Douglas Stevens is a professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And you have been a professor for how long now in total?
Oh my goodness. So I graduated from Indiana with my PhD in 95. So that must be 31 years. Oh my goodness. And my students still find me entertaining for some reason. The longer I teach, the more stories I come up with, and I try to be as applied as I possibly can. And again, I really am noticing that more and more of our MBAs are very connected with entrepreneurship. They're very connected with their values and their norms, and they are very interested in finding their meaning in life and making a contribution. And that's remarkable. That's a great trend.
Very much so. I'm a lecturer in the College of Business, and I focus on entrepreneurship and innovation in what I teach. I'm finding the same thing, but of course on the undergrad level. However, I'm wondering how far things will go in their lives before it's kind of squeezed out of them, that desire to do right, find jobs and find value in their careers and being navigated by their own value system. Because we all, start out wanting to do good, and then we get out here and see the reality. Then we're like, oh, wait, like this is actually a game that there are powers that I can't overcome. I'm like a nobody in all of this. And then they kind of just fall in line. And I think that's just what has happened over the decades in this country.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I teach the core accounting course in the full-time and online MBA program. And so our MBA students have to get through me first. And so I've always taught the accounting from a financial economics point of view. I've always started with the theory of the firm, and that is Milton Friedman and George Stigler and the Chicago School. And I would start out just teaching it straight up. And then I'd say, but we know that they avoided a lot of moral and social factors, and they created a picture of economic man called Homo economicus. And that's a person who's motivated only by wealth and leisure. And as the decades roll by, we've been able to talk more and more about if that's the narrow view of economic man or woman, the decision maker, the economic decision maker, what is the correct view? And so it's gotten more and more interesting, especially as I write on this topic. My first book was Social Norms and the Theory of the Firm. And that's the book that I still use in all of my classes to first of all, introduce the underlying theory of the firm in accounting and finance. And yes, it is very narrow, and it is the way we discuss it in class now, we just come out and say it's the greedy, lazy view of economic decisions.
Oh my goodness. Those are the two words. That's it.
Greedy, lazy, greedy and lazy. And that's what the Chicago School built economic theory related to accounting and finance on. Now, I have connected with an independent researcher at the Madden Center for Value Creation, Bart Madden. And he's developed a pragmatic theory of the firm, and I was not aware of it until just about 2 years ago. And he approached it in a totally different perspective, looking at how the firm creates value through entrepreneurship, through innovation. And he started reading my stuff and this second book on the moral foundations of capitalism. And so I've been working with him to incorporate shared values and social norms into his pragmatic theory of the firm. So I'm kind of doing a very practical now, very applied research stream with him. And I'm still doing my original experimental economics research, going into the lab and just testing that good old neoclassical Chicago theory of the firm.
How relevant would you say that is today?
The people that I write about in my book, they all looked at capitalism in a broad view. And that broad view characterized all of their viewpoints right up until the Chicago School. So they always looked at capitalism from the perspective of a realistic, how can we make it better? And so they always focused on the vulnerabilities and excesses of unregulated markets. And so we can talk more about that later, but the problem now is since the 1970s and the narrow view promoted by the Chicago School, we've thrown away that caution. We've thrown away that concern about the vulnerabilities and excesses of unregulated markets. And so if you've seen what's going on with college football today, if you've seen what's going on with gambling and college sports, and people are really seeing that something is awry in the capitalistic system that we have here in the United States. And so it's time to go back and think about, again, the moral foundations of capitalism.
So here we are, we're using that term moral foundation, we're saying values, but in a country as diverse as the US, right? Everyone comes with their own set of what they think is moral and what they think are values that everyone should have. And it's so much variation. And it seems to as well change with the administration that's in there. So we're always at this push for more regulation, less regulation. And we're in this yo-yo period now where folks are starting to lose faith in that definition that is supposed to, do we allow the markets to rule everything, or do we rule from this value system and morals that in reality, the definition of them are changing all the time?
That's a great point. The question is not, is there a moral foundation for capital? The question is, which moral foundation do we want to choose? And what are we moving toward? So I don't know if you remember the part on Karl Polanyi, but he had a theory called the double movement. And he said, we're always moving toward and then away from free markets.
Right.
So to push or promote economic growth, we release the markets and we reduce regulation. And then at some point, that makes the vulnerabilities and excesses of unregulated markets very clear. And so there is a counter movement, and we start to try to rein in those excesses and try to take care of society. And so Polanyi went back through the whole history of England when we first went away from pastures to more modern economic systems. And he was able to show how there was that double movement, always back and forth. And you see that in America all the time too.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you talk about how concentrated wealth and opportunistic business behavior in the early 1900s created a general mistrust of big business. Now, fast forward to today, public trust in corporations and government is tanking again, but not by everyone. That's the thing. It's very divided right now. But what parallels do you see between that era and this past decade?
So you're talking about the 1800s when we had the first industrial revolution in Britain, and we know of all the novels that were written about how poorly the workers were treated and how they had children and women working in the sweatshops, and that's not a very comforting view, and that's a very stern warning of what capitalism can become when we forget the social and moral responsibilities. Now, the interesting thing is now we have come out of a period where the social and moral responsibilities of capitalism have expanded, and we just came out of the ESG, environmental, social, and governance era, and I'm sure you're aware of that. And
are we out of it for good, though? That's what I'm wondering. Right? Because like I just said, it seems to change with administration.
Before that, it was corporate social responsibility, and that reigned for a long time, probably about 4 decades. And then that fell out of favor. We couldn't deal with all of the responsibilities, so we moved on to ESG, and that was a short life. I mean, it fired up in 2018, 2019, and then by 2023, you had major corporations backing off their commitments to ESG, of course, now DEI as well. So I think it's because we haven't been able to figure out, so what is the purpose of the firm? What are those responsibilities to society and to the environment? And I've got a quote, before we leave, Milton Friedman, that kind of shows you what Friedman's perspective on all this was. And I like to poke Friedman in the eye because I was trained at Purdue University in my MBA and then at Indiana during my PhD under the Friedman doctrine.
Okay.
So all that mattered was earning profits for shareholders. And that was it. That was the only responsibility of the firm. And so my experimental economics, my archival trade environment research was all from that perspective and trying to extend that theory of the firm. So when you look at what Friedman said, and so you always hear people quoting his 1970 article, okay? And it would make you realize that he would have thought ESG should have never gotten off the ground. So here's what he said. I say on page 159, Friedman's view of the capitalist system as comprised of narrowly self-interested agents coordinated through competitive markets with no role for government can be seen in his famous 1970 article in the New York Times Magazine entitled, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Now, I love to read this to my MBA students and then get their feedback. He wrote, In the article, he argued that incorporating any notion of social responsibility in business was a, quote, fundamentally subversive doctrine, end quote, in a free society. In particular, Friedman asserted that the claim that business is responsible for promoting desirable, quote, social ends, and then he lists them, such as providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers, is preaching pure and unadulterated socialism.
That's crazy.
So this is in 1970, and corporate social responsibility was just coming into vogue.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, he wanted none of it. He wanted to push that completely out of the discussion space. And so you kind of get an idea what direction he wanted capitalism to go.
Right. I was reading along with you. I have your book in front of me too, and I have so many things tabbed. I was reading along with you, and the thought that just because the firm helps with social issues, not even just social, when we think about ESG, the environmental part, like just personally, to me, that's important because the focus of that is to ensure there's longevity of life on the planet. So I would think that's something that corporations would want to ensure. But to think that even something like that is seen as being unadulterated socialism is insane to me. But the thing is, there at different times, as I mentioned, at different times, there are different folks in the administration that feel extreme measures on one end or the other. Who decides? Do we decide with our purchasing power, which is something a lot of folks, have mentioned to be that fight back. But with power, what do we do?
So I have to cut Friedman a little bit of slack because he had so little theory to go on, and he was
Yeah.
really trying to build our knowledge. And I have published with Bart Madnow in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, and there has been a whole lot of really good research done under the Chicago School. And Don Chu, the editor of the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, was always tugging us back and saying, yeah, you're criticizing the Chicago School, but remember, they provided a whole lot of opportunity and a whole lot of economic growth and got us out of a lot of malaise in the 70s and 80s and after the 2007, 2008. So that's the power of the market. And so what Milton Friedman had no understanding or no sensitivity toward is the old view where capitalism had certain vulnerabilities and excesses. And so, boy, we now know that with these multinational corporations, they literally can threaten whole species. And we do know, I'm not sure that net zero should ever be a goal, but we sure need to keep one eye on the excesses of capitalism to protect our planet. And most all of my MBA students, they have values that that include being responsible to the environment, responsible to people, various viewpoints. Viewpoint diversity is a big thing in the university today, and I'm a big promoter of that. And so I really wrote this book to focus on the search for a moral foundation for capitalism, because that will never stop.
That will never stop. In chapter 3 of your book, you talk about religion as a moral foundation. Tawny he worried that capitalism without a moral compass will become acquisitive, right? So do you see that happening now? Or are we misdiagnosing the problem?
So I like to ask my MBAs after I describe the greedy, lazy Homo economicus view of the Chicago school, I ask. So does this describe you? And they say, no, no, of course not. And the interesting thing about Tawney is he was deeply religious. So he was Anglican at a time when Britain was part Catholic and part Protestant. And he had a real heart for society. And I include the story of him going to the front in World War I and fighting at the Battle of the Somme, where it was almost certain death. You were going to be charging across the line, and he got riddled with machine gun fire, and he went back and always lived with that pain. But he did that because his undergrad and grad students at Manchester were being called up, and he would not, even though he was released from any obligation, he was in his mid-30s, he had such a view of his own personal responsibility that he could not see his students go to the front without him going as well. At the same time, he was very active in the forming of the London School of Economics. And some of the founders of that school had very socialist views. And so some people have written off R.H. Tawney because some of his views were a little to the left of some of the people at his time. But I wanted to include him in the book because Christian socialism in Britain at that time was totally different than Marxist socialism. It was very much a heart for the poor, a heart for the downtrodden, and making sure that those excesses and vulnerabilities of capitalism didn't leave the needy behind. And so I'm really glad I discovered Tawney. He's always impacted my thinking after reading about his life and his view. He was the Catholic component of Weber. So Max Weber, or Weber, if you want to pronounce it. He also was coming from a deeply religious background, but he was seeing the move away from Christianity as a basis for economics. And so even though he called himself unmusical and would probably call himself an agnostic today, he gave us a very historical, scientific, practical view of the birth of capitalism in America. And so he went all the way back from the 1700s to 1800s. He visited America. And so we have a record of how much our religious heritage in America influenced the way capitalism started, developed, and avoided many of the problems that capitalism continues to have in Europe.
Yeah. It's interesting how a lot of times, especially like now, there is disregard for just cultural differences, which of course stem from the history of the country. And then also here, we have a lot of immigration, and that's what this country is built upon, like the diversity of folks that come in from all over. So then we end up with kind of this big pot of different ideals. And it's making it even more challenging to decide how we move forward and think about these things. And it just seems like it evolves over time, because we talked about, several different thought and foundations of people's perspectives over, the centuries. But when we have such a diverse population and value system, who gets to decide?
Yeah. I kind of like the discussion about the dueling authoritarianism. So that has kind of become a major issue today. So you have people talking about fascism on the right and, of course, Marxist socialism on the left. And
But those are two extremes.
they're real extremes.
Yeah, and it's more political and meant to rage sells these days. So the more extreme of the language and the more extreme of painting either side gets this spark of emotion and of support from those that you want to be in agreement with you. So it's just kind of hard. Those are extremes, but okay. Yeah.
But did you notice every one of the characters in my book, except for the Chicago School
Mhm.
founders and Ayn Rand,
Yes.
all ended up in the middle,
Yeah.
all in their attempt to deal with the vulnerabilities and excesses of capitalism, rejected those extremes as utopian
Mhm.
and always strove for the middle ground. Now, getting back to Milton Friedman, you know how he hammered John Maynard Keynes. And it was because John Maynard Keynes had the audacity to think the government had the responsibility to reduce unemployment that came as a result of World War I and the depression that followed that. And so we have to be very careful when we're taking positions to label those that have a different viewpoint.
Different
And
point. Yeah.
yeah, you're right on about that. And so in researching and writing this book, I really found myself moving to the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so you bring so many interesting perspectives throughout this book. And I remember when I first got the book, I sent you an email, was like, this is fascinating. Like I was captivated from just when I first started, you were telling about your background, the background and going through COVID and how you saw certain things ignited even here in Atlanta. And you kind of go on this journey of people in these different mindsets with, uh, Keynes, I guess that's how you pronounce it.
Yes, Keynes.
So, yeah, so he's actually one that thought that markets are powerful, but they're unstable, and the government's job to stabilize capitalism and all of that. But here's the thing, and I'm saying from what we're experiencing and seeing right now with tariffs. So tariffs, right? So here's the thing, it's like I'm gonna use a term that's kind of a modern day term, but people are seeing the government play in their face. And what I mean by that is we will say the government shouldn't have the responsibility, but then we'll see certain decisions made without input from Congress that affects everyone, such as the tariffs. So, everyone is paying more for things. And now we have companies now suing the government for the tariffs that they pay. So it's like, where are you? Where are you on, is this the direction that we're going or not? And it seems to be that it depends on the interest, the personal interest of whoever is in power or folks that are in power and what their philosophy is. So do they have the responsibility or not?
So Polanyi's double movement is very much alive. So the double movement again is whenever you have a lull in economic growth, you have those that rush in and say, let's free up the markets.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, that is effective. And it got us out of the 70s and 80s stagflation, and it will do the job to get us over this hump right now.
And okay.
But again, the reaction to that. So the counter movement will be when you have some of the vulnerabilities become very clear, the excesses. And then you're going to have the movement back to where the government is going to have to figure out what it's responsible for and what it needs to do. I was born and raised just out of Detroit, Michigan. And when I was growing up in the 60s, there was never a more happening city. There were suburbs flourishing, all these General Motors and Pontiac and Ford. There's Pontiac Motors before General Motors, and then Ford and Chrysler, and all these executives living in these very plush suburbs and the city was just thriving, and you could go into the city and watch the Tigers and the Pistons and the Red Wings, and that's gone.
Yeah.
Why? Why? So I am in Atlanta and I'm seeing some of the poor public policy choices being made. And I'm afraid because people in Atlanta don't understand that you could be Detroit in a couple decades. If you don't know how to manage your growth, if you don't know how to deal with the responsibilities of government without overspending, and it's a challenge. It will always be. But I believe in capitalism because I've seen its flexibility. I've seen its ability to grow and develop. And that's, again, a major theme in my book is people from, again, Haber or Weber believed that capitalism was able to adapt and grow. And no matter what culture, no matter what time, it would be able at least to meet the needs of the people better than the alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are different kinds of capitalism. So this is an entrepreneurial channel. So you're exactly right. If we squelch the motivation and the potential for success of entrepreneurs, capitalism dies. And so we have to be very careful that any government programs, anything we do to soften free market capitalism doesn't harm our entrepreneurial. So that's one of the kinds of capitalism, actually, entrepreneurial capitalism. And we've lived in those periods, right? The automobile started in the early 1900s. That was entrepreneurial capitalism. Silicon Valley was born in the late 1990s. That was entrepreneurial capitalism. There's also big firm capitalism. So you're very aware of all the private equity firms that come in and turn an entrepreneurial idea into a large corporation or large market and distribution system. And so that feeds the fire in the entrepreneurs that they will be able to yield a return on their risk. But there's also oligarchic capitalism in various parts of the world and state-guided capitalism like Japan has for a long time and South Korea. And so there are all these different kinds, and it's adapting and it's changing, but still there's researchers say that the optimal form of capitalism is a mixture of big firm capitalism and entrepreneurial capitalism.
For real. Sometimes the entrepreneurial is allowed to run amok. The FTX case is a great minor example of what happens when capitalism runs without a moral restraint. And for those that are listening that aren't familiar with that case, that's the cryptocurrency. I call it a Ponzi scheme with Sam Friedman Bank.
Sam Bankman-Fried.
Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah.
Friedman, yep.
He's in prison now, but that's one example. But people also often mistake intelligence or innovation for integrity. So in the real world, we know some people have these different coloring for what they believe is right and what is okay. And, for a while, it seemed like with this founder, this entrepreneur in general, I mean, if he could have gotten away with it longer, he would have.
Yeah, Sam Bankman-Fried was a brilliant entrepreneur, and he saw cryptocurrency for what it could do in these markets. But he had some very serious personality flaws.
Yeah.
And I just touch on that in this book, but I don't go into it in real detail. What I like is I like to be positive. And getting back to Weber or Weber, if you're German, he was very specific about the demands of being an entrepreneur and the role of either religious or deep moral convictions. And this is what he said. He said, few people are sufficiently clear-sighted. This is on page 127.
Okay.
Few people are sufficiently clear-sighted to be aware of the unusual strength of character that is required from this new type of entrepreneur. And he was talking again of America.
And he put it in quotes, new type, quote unquote.
Yes, a new type of entrepreneur, as well as energy and clarity of vision. He will need, we can say she will need certain outstanding, quote, ethical qualities to win the absolutely indispensable confidence of the clients and of the workers when introducing these innovations, and to maintain the vigor necessary to overcome the innumerable obstacles that he or she will meet. It is these qualities, above all, which have made possible the infinitely more intensive work rate that is now demanded of the entrepreneur. There is no longer any place for the comfortable lifestyle. These ethical qualities are quite different in kind from those that were adequate for the traditionalism of the past. I saw Bianca's question. Did you see her question?
Bianca, do you want to ask the question? Sure. Okay, go ahead. This is so fascinating. It's like right on time conversation. And so I asked my first set of questions, and if I can ask my second set, let me know, Monique. Yep. I think that what you're doing is phenomenal, especially when you're teaching the MBA students. Do you know of any other teachers or professors who are teaching and speaking to the MBA students about the moral gap in business?
We have many faculty who are adopting the new ESG, or the environmental and social responsibility view of business and capitalism. And so one of those, I actually met Monique at this sustainability conference, and there was full of faculty who were talking about the responsibility, the environmental and social responsibility of business. And Nezreen, one of our colleagues, was there, and Nate Bennett, with the executive MBA, he emphasizes those things, and Jacobus and a lot of our faculty. So it's almost irresponsible to not talk about environmental and social responsibility in your class. Now, having said that, I have walked around the halls at Buckhead and 55 Park, and I think it's more still isolated in marketing and in management, and we still too often leave it out of accounting, and especially in finance. So that's why my research and my writing is going to forever focus on those two disciplines. They were the ones that were the most affected by the Homo economicus view promoted by the Chicago School. That's a great question, though.
Thank you. Monique, can I ask my second one? So you kind of touched on why you think it's important, but if you could share a little bit more about it. And I know that you're impacting and influencing new MBAs. What would it take to have that same impact and influence on existing corporate decision makers now?
So I'm writing a paper on what the Chicago School got wrong about the wealth of nations. And so I am submitting that for a conference celebrating the 250-year anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Well, Monique, you know that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, and that he wrote a book about morality and the moral foundations of capitalism, which he called commercial society. They hadn't invented capitalism as a word yet. And he wrote that in 1759, and he kept updating it until the year of his death in 1790. So whereas the Chicago School would like him to make Adam Smith the author of their narrow view of capitalism, he would have rejected that view utterly and completely. And so that's kind of my niche right now. I'm trying to present my work at these conferences, and I'm writing a third book on what the Chicago School got wrong about Adam Smith to try to reach out. And this is what us faculty get to do. We get to do research that interests us and then kind of prod people and poke people and say, hey, have you thought about this? And so I guess if I'm going to say that, I guess I should probably give that quote on page 101 on what Adam Smith actually said about self-interest. Do you want to hear what he actually said?
Let's do it. I'm opening to page 101.
I like to read this before my students know what I'm up to.
Yeah.
And I ask them, who wrote that and who said that? And this is the supposed author of Narrow Self-Interest. At least that's what Milton Friedman and George Stigler in the Chicago School said. So here's what he actually wrote. The wise and virtuous man is at all times willing that his own private interest should be sacrificed to the public interest of his own particular order of society. He is at all willing, too, that the interest of this order or society should be sacrificed to the greater interest of the state or sovereignty, of which it is only a subordinate part. He should therefore be equally willing that all those inferior interests with certain subgroups and subcultures should be sacrificed to the greater interest of the universe, to the interest of that great society of all sensible and intelligent beings, of which God himself is the immediate administrator and director. So that was from that's one of the last things he wrote before he died. So no, he did not become a pagan after visiting the Paris aristocrats and coming back from Paris. He did not change his views on self-interest. He always had this view of responsibility and duty. And that's where the biggest confusion lies.
Yeah.
So the one or two passages that the Chicago School take out of context to make Adam Smith the author of Narrow Self-Interest is when he's talking about our duty or our responsibility to ourselves. And he calls that prudence, but he calls it self-love. And that's what the Chicago School focused on. And again, that's not what Adam Smith said at all. He did not narrow all of our motivations to the greedy, lazy, utility maximizing person. It hadn't been invented yet, and he certainly would never have invented it.
In his book, in The Wealth of Nations, so in your book on page 101 as well. So it says, as we have seen in The Wealth of Nations, self-love is a motive of human behavior only to the extent that it is used as an argument to persuade others to engage in commercial exchange. So it's almost like they wanted to take some of the things he said out of context to try to paint him to be a certain way. He said markets aren't enough by themselves. They need moral norms. He said capitalism only works when people act with moral responsibility and social sympathy. And it's like an oversimplification of his beliefs has been perpetuated by modern economists. So,
well, I know we're running out of time, Monique, but I wanted to say this. First of all, you are not an unpolished MBA. You are a very polished MBA. You are what I tell my MBA students, you're that rare combination of a quant and a poet. So I always try to get my MBAs who are heavily quantitative and very mathematical based to read more deeply, to get into literature and to awaken the poet. And then I have those people that come into my class and they are scared to death because they're poets. They're like I was. They came out of an undergrad of liberal arts and the humanities, and they don't know what a derivative is.
Okay.
And so I try to tell them, I'm going to develop your quant like I did to survive at Purdue. I had to awaken my quant real quick, like you did at Georgia Tech. But the Chicago school was full of quants, and they did not read. They did not understand their literature, and they surely never read Adam Smith's whole. They just read snippets. They did not read all of his work, and that was always and continues to be amazing to me, how they could speak for Adam Smith when they never really read his works.
Indeed. That's because people want to paint whatever picture they want to paint, right?
They just used him.
Support.
Yeah. He was a muse. He was the muse for the Chicago school.
Fascinating, fascinating book. It is a wonderful read. I can't thank you enough for sharing it with me. Before we hop off, I just need 2 minutes of your time to address the rise of AI, right? We can't really put our finger on the moral foundation. We're all searching for the moral foundation for that, because at the rate that it's going, it will create some new jobs, but we're pretty sure that it will destroy a lot of existing jobs that we have because it can be automated. And for those that are creating these technologies, they even say that, well, we're going to have to probably implement universal basic income, which is UBI for those who may have heard the acronym before, because we have to take care of people. Right? They still need to eat. They can't work because there's not enough jobs for everyone. So we're constantly on this search. Well, tell me your thoughts on that with
I'm
AI.
so glad you raised that, because I view the search for a moral foundation for capitalism as the issue of our age.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you why. AI is a perfect example of the vulnerabilities and excesses of unrestrained capitalism or entrepreneurialism. This is entrepreneurial capitalism run amok. And so before we've even read a single book from our Western catalog, before we've looked at what people viewed as important and moral in the past, we're going to turn all that over to artificial intelligence and let it tell us what our morals should be. And that's how bad it's gotten. So that's a prime example where we need to return to the view of capitalism as containing these vulnerabilities and excesses and do what it takes. It can be adapted. It can meet the needs of society, but it will adapt and it will evolve, and there'll be these swings back and forth, but it's going to be exciting.
I agree. And that's one thing I believe in is the good of humanity. And I'm so thankful earlier that you said, yeah, I like to be positive. Me too. So I see a lot of doom and gloom posts on LinkedIn, for example, about, oh boy, it's, we're all going to be, hungry in the streets. And, it's like doom and gloom. But I have faith in humanity. We've proven that we can get through these things and evolve as needed to survive.
Absolutely.
And not just survive, but thrive and still have the amount of pleasure and joy in our lives. And this is just a great conversation that's going to continue. I see a few more books just coming out of you elaborating on some of these points that I hope maybe will come out in the future, or maybe some additional research on these topics. So Doug,
absolutely. I haven't stopped yet.
Please don't. And for those of you listening, I will link to Doug's book in the show notes. And this has been one of those conversations that will stick with us long after recording stops. And what I appreciate about your work is that it forces us to zoom out. We get so focused on, quarter to quarter wins or the latest tech we have or whatever crisis is right in front of us. But we forget that capitalism only works when people believe that the system is fair enough to participate in.
Yes.
I don't want people to stop participating. One of the things I do in my classes is encourage my students. I'm like, don't fall into the despair of what you're hearing on the news. Like, don't do it. And I just had my final presentations for my students yesterday. Again, give them those words of encouragement to continue to participate. And they will see, they will be shocked at, wow. Okay,
Yes, they will.
actually worked.
Absolutely. They will.
So, Doug, I want to thank you again for joining me and for sharing some details of your book with us. Thank you.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Unpolished MBA podcast. To hear more episodes or to request to become a guest, please visit unpolishedmba.com.
Are you running a business that's doing okay, but you know it could be doing better with the right strategy behind it? At TPM Focus, we help organizations get unstuck. Whether you're launching something new, navigating disruption, or aligning your operations with your financial goals, we bring clarity and, most importantly, we execute. If you're tired of random acts and ready to get intentional about cash flow and growth, visit tpmfocus.com.